Hey, welcome to A Little Better. My name is Daniel, and I'll be your host. Today, me and Brad are on the podcast talking all about the end of the world. We're diving in for the first week on the book of Revelation, and I know you're excited, so let's jump right in. Remember, our goal in this podcast is to know Jesus better, and by the power of His Spirit, do better, so together we can be a little better. Hey, welcome to A Little Better. We're super excited to dive into the end of the world.
As we know it.
As we know it. That's us, doing our own rendition because you don't want us to sing.
Not
that
good.
we would lose listeners if that's the case. You may not hear Drew or see Drew depending on how you're watching or listening, and that's because the man had conflict in his schedule. So it's just the two of us, Brad. He's not here to hold us back. All right, so we're gonna dive into. We're starting a brand new series, and we started a brand new series on the book of Revelation, creatively titled Revelation. Because what's more interesting than just that book in itself, the book of the Bible that everyone has
Hours and hours of creative team meetings.
Yeah, it took a lot for us to come up with that. Yeah, for sure. I threw out some really creative titles like The Woman and the Dragon. And I'm like, no, not doing that one. Not doing that one.
Stay in your lane.
Yeah, stay in my lane, right? Yeah, so we're going to dive into the book of Revelation, and really our goal today is just how should we approach this book? We're going to ask probably a handful of questions, go back and forth about the book of Revelation, setting it up. But just remember, from Sunday, we talked about that if you have questions as you listen to the sermon series, listen to the podcast series, or read the book yourself, if you're listening to it in real time, meaning as we're doing the series, we're going to be taking questions. You may remember a couple months back, we did that in the Heaven series. So if you just go to iwant.info website, you can click a button there that says submit a question about Revelation. You text us your question in. It will show up probably on the podcast. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can. If there's anything like the Heaven series, we had over 300 questions come in. So that was a doozy.
Yeah.
So we'll see how this one's received. We're excited to dig a little deeper into Revelation.
Be kind. Be kind.
That's
with your
right. Be
questions.
kind. So here's my first question, Brad. How should I even approach this book? Because I get really excited in chapters 1 through 3, and then it starts getting a little weird. And it progressively gets weirder.
It does.
So how should I even think about approaching the book?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. And I've struggled with it, too. But as Drew, assuming you've heard his sermon, as he's pointed out, that I think the greatest value from the book of Revelation is how it influences how we live today, right? There's all kinds of questions that will be raised, as you go deeper into the book.
Yeah.
They don't all need to be answered.
Yeah.
But the questions that impact, what are my priorities? What are my values? What are my confidences, about the future? The things that will influence the way I live today. Those are important questions to answer. The timing of certain things, or how many, what the these number of horns, or heads on the beast, or whatever. I mean, there's going to be all kinds of things that we can make guesses at. But there are things that John says with great clarity that do impact how we live today.
You said there are certain questions that we don't need the answer to?
I think so.
You think so? Yeah, that's good. I was talking to somebody this past week about that exact same topic. And, a common Bible verse that gets cited a lot is in Isaiah, where it says, God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and His ways are higher than our ways. And I said, I think there's an even better scripture that we can point to talking about this. In Deuteronomy 29:29, Moses is doing one of his last speeches to the nation of Israel before he passes away and they enter the promised land, that whole bit. And he says that there are things of God that are revealed, and there are things that are hidden. Like that we will not know the answer to, that God, in His infinite wisdom, with His thoughts being higher than our thoughts, His ways being higher than our ways, it's not that they're hard to know, that we won't actually know, that He will keep those things hidden from us. And there's certain things of how He operates, how He's engaging in the world that we just won't know the answer to.
And that list is going to change over time.
For sure,
right?
yeah.
Because, we do know we as New Testament believers see some things with clarity Old
Yep,
Testament
for sure,
believers didn't.
100%.
So that list was longer.
Yeah.
Like in the Old Testament, it's getting shorter, but it's
Yeah.
still not empty.
Yeah, for sure,
There's
yeah.
still a lot of things yet. And I suppose we could even spend our time in eternity with some of them unanswered.
Yeah.
But
That's
yes.
part of what it means for God to be God, right? We can't fully wrap our minds or our hands around what it means for God to be who he is and the work the way he does. Because if we could wrap our hands all the way around him, then he would no longer exist to be God and he wouldn't be worthy of our worship. But he is, and part of that is the fact that his knowledge is infinite and ours is finite in nature. So that's good. I like the way that you frame that up. So here's the next question. Revelation, right? Apocalypse, end of the world. That's what that word means, right?
I think it means to uncover.
Is it so interesting that I'm a language nerd at the core of me, and I think it's so interesting, like words and their meaning and how they've evolved over time and how different cultures and settings and eras have thought about different words.
Right.
And there's a lot of nuancing in the original languages of the Bible, that how they've, went from, maybe even a German word to an English word, and how, as we dive in, it's like, man, look at how the true heart of this word has remained. Like it's kind of the meaning is carried along with it. But this word revelation, which in Greek is apocalypse or apocalypso, and then we get our word apocalypse, the meanings have went so far in different directions.
Yeah. The word revelation is more on target to reveal. That's a whole lot closer to that unveiling, uncovering.
Yeah, it is really close.
But apocalypse?
Apocalypse, that's where we get the word. It's apocalypse.
We're talking The Walking Dead now.
Yeah, right.
And just a whole, Hollywood has a rich industry of post-apocalyptic media.
There's so many movies that we could, reference, like, oh, that's talking about the apocalypse, you know? And so, but it'd be weird if in our Bibles in English, it would be like the apocalypse of John. We would, it's like, but that would be pretty faithful
literally
to
true, yeah.
the original language. That would be really faithful to the original language. But the meaning behind what we think when we hear the word apocalypse, very different from, because you gave us what it means. The word originally literally means to make known, to reveal, to uncover. The Bible Project has a really cool video about reading apocalyptic literature. And the way that they do it with their cartoon illustrations is there's this girl sitting in her bedroom reading a book, and she looks to her bedroom window, and which has curtains and blinds, and what looks like is this big scary man or the beast, something's like about to come and get her in her. And it's like, oh my goodness. And then she pulls back the curtains, and it's like a ladder with a tree and a mop bucket. Sure. And it's like, this was the unveil. She unveiled the truth, what was behind it. And the apocalypse was she got to see what was really happening. And I think what's cool in this series is there's this tagline that we've thought of as we've written it, is like, what is the book of Revelation trying to do? Or what is its central message, if you want to say that? And really we boiled it down to be faithful now. Be faithful now in light of what's coming. And you may not hear that exact wording in every sermon, but the undertones of every sermon will be faithful now, but in light of what's coming.
And even though the book of Revelation itself, there's a lot of confusion, uncertainty. What does that mean? That happens in our present lives too. You're going to try to read current events and make sense of them or circumstances. And there's going to be a lot of confusion there too, right? Things that we may not understand until heaven, if ever, yet. It's that same thing. In light of very disorienting, confusing things, what can we hold on to tightly? We can hold on to tightly that Jesus will make it right in the end. We need to live today knowing that with a certainty that he is coming.
Yeah. There was a really important point that Drew pointed out in his sermon this weekend, which was that we really need to understand our Old Testament in order to read Revelation. Why is that? Why do we need to know about something else, the Old Testament, in order to really understand Revelation?
Well, there's certainly a whole lot of things that not all prophecy is in Revelation. Right. So there's a lot of things that get amplified, added to, there's Old Testament books also rich, with
Yeah.
prophecy and other New Testament books. Is it the man of lawlessness? Is that in First or Second Thessalonians?
Yeah, so First and Second Thessalonians, we get rapture,
Right.
like
So-
verses, and man of lawlessness. I
Right,
think Second
right.
Thessalonians.
Right.
is
So we definitely
man
need
of
to go
lawlessness.
outside the book of Revelation to get commentary on the book of Revelation, elsewhere in the New Testament,
Yeah.
as well as the whole framework of the Old Testament, as well as the whole arc of history, right?
Yeah.
We're going from the garden, to the city of God at the
Yeah.
end. And to understand that entire arc and story. That's the way I like, some movies. It's common in movies today to almost start with the end.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, what the heck is happening? You
Yeah.
know? And then they spend the rest of the time, unpacking that. But I
Yeah.
think if you get confused in
Yeah.
Revelation, what the heck is happening? You can back up to the whole arc of redemptive history.
That's such a good
and
illustration.
see
Those
what's-
are those popular movies that the opening scene is like you get this no context, right? You have like zero context for what's happening. You're like, oh my gosh, what is that? And then it's a black screen or it's a transition.
Yeah.
And then you spend the rest of the movie telling you the backstory, building up to that one
Right.
scene that you saw in the beginning.
Right.
And then they resolve the tension in the last
Right.
5 minutes. And
So,
then
you'll never understand Revelation without the Old Testament backstory.
yeah, because
of
Drew
how we
gave us
got
those
there.
stats, right? 70% of the of Revelation is either an Old Testament citation, allusion, or illustration.
Right.
And so one of those three categories. And one other fact that there's 500 Old Testament quotes
Wow.
or allusions in the book of Revelation.
Wow.
500. That means a significant portion of Revelation is just commentating or expanding upon the Old Testament foundations of imagery and language and
Yep.
and everything else.
Yeah.
Eugene Peterson, scholar, theologian, he points out in one of his books on Revelation that Revelation teaches us nothing new. Is what he points out. He teaches us nothing new. Now, I don't know if I'd go all in with him there.
Yeah.
But he says it is there to awaken our imagination of what we've already been taught. It's there to incite our imagination and stir our fire within us of what is there. And I get where he's going, with that thinking. But it's pretty interesting that it teaches us nothing new.
Yeah, I love that you use the word imagination too.
Yeah.
Because as I try to be somewhat creative, but I certainly appreciate creativity. And there's something about kind of truth and trying to understand, but there's also beauty, right? And you just think of all the times when God was revealed and just how disoriented people were, right? So whether it was on the Mount Sinai to Moses, or Isaiah is in the temple and just gets this glimmer
Yeah.
of God, or here John being blown away, we're not supposed to take away a bunch of facts about God on
Yeah.
that, but we are supposed to be undone by his beauty,
Yeah.
his glory, and
good.
just and how that overwhelms us. So I love that idea of imagination. So some of it here, in Revelation is we're not going to understand, but we are going to be on our knees in awe of what we see.
Yeah, for sure. And you talk about imagination, being in awe of what we see. You're talking about a lot of these things. And I think what's helpful next in our conversation is to talk about when we're approaching Revelation. We've kind of framed up the background. We've framed up imagination. We framed up a lot of things. But this Revelation is literature, right? It's a book. It's words. That's what it is. So we need to approach it in the way that it presents itself. And we've talked about, before we think about approaching it, knowing the background, knowing what it's setting out to do.
Right.
But what kind of literature is Revelation?
So
Yeah.
I mean, Daniel asked so many of these questions. He knows the answer. He knows the answer. And then he's asking him like, it's prophecy. It's prophetic. I know that we have narrative, we have poetry, we have, how many genres are we talking about here? But you would put Revelation in the camp of prophecy. It's very poetic. It's certainly not, narrative storytelling.
So Ray Lubeck, I think, is a super helpful Bible scholar, theologian, seminary professor at Western Seminary in Portland, Oregon. And he talks about that there are three, in the Bible specifically, there are three literary types.
Okay.
So those are broad categories, and then there are genres that fit underneath those types. We talk a lot about genres, but I think what's problematic for people who may not have went to seminary and studied the Bible like in an educational like setting, like in an institution, is talking about there's 7 or 8 different genres of scripture. Could be a little overwhelming. It's like, oh my, 7 or 8, and I got to know how to approach every single one of those.
Sure.
But I think what's helpful is Ray Lubeck talks about literary types, and he says there's 3. There's 3 literary types. There's narrative. Then there's discourse. And poetry. All right.
Narrative,
discourse and poetry. And Revelation would fit under narrative. So you said it wasn't narrative. But it is, because he defines narrative. So discourse would be Paul's letters, that there are direct speeches, in Old Testament and New Testament. And about, I know 33% of the Bible is made up of the poetry. About 40-ish% is made up of narrative, 43% somewhere, and then the remaining like 24% would fall into the discourse category. It's funny that the discourse category is probably our Western mind favorite, but it's the smallest,
So in the New
category.
Testament, discourse, Paul's letters, things like that. Old Testament, all that Levitical law and stuff.
All
that's
the law,
discourse. Boom,
discourse.
boom,
It's
boom.
just like boom, point.
Right.
So a narrative. So what is a narrative as a literary type? It's getting its point across by unfolding a story, and so that's what Revelation is doing. It is unfolding. It's by telling a story. Now it's a specific type of narrative, and it would be apocalyptic, prophetic narrative is the type. And so to understand that type of literature, that apocalyptic literature employs immense imagery, imagination, symbolism, by telling its story. So it's highly symbolic.
So it's those words like symbolism, imagery, stuff like that made me think poetry, but you're really saying it's still in the narrative type?
I would say it's still in the narrative type, but this is what's interesting about the book of Revelation. I think as a whole, like piece of literature that we can say, okay, it fits into the apocalyptic narrative. That's the kind of literature that Revelation is as a whole. But within Revelation, what makes it so difficult is, I think 6 of the 7 different genres, we can make a good case that they're all contained in Revelation. As it opens up, if we just do a quick outline, right?
Oh, you've got the letters to the churches.
Letters to the churches. There's discourse right there. Jesus is telling. There is even gospel narrative in the fact of Jesus revealing himself and saying, it is I that is speaking to you, John. Revelation chapter 1, verses 9 through 20-ish.
Behold the Lamb who was
Behold the
slain.
Lamb, there he is. There's poetry, there's songs, Revelation chapter 4 and 5, and multiple other parts, chapter 11, chapter 16, I think. There are songs that the saints are singing.
Poetry.
And that's poetry. That's what a song is. It's poetry. And then there's narrative in the sense of the chapter 1. He's framing up what is happening, and even the whole story is telling a narrative, historical story about a specific set of 7 churches that are there. And so that's what makes Revelation so hard to like really put our handles on. Is like, man, I start reading and I'm in one frame of mind. Like if you pick up Galatians, you're like, okay, this is a discourse to the churches in Galatia. Abdil and Paul's talking here. This is who he's talking to. Let me read this letter, right? You pick up Revelation, it's like, okay, I'm in historical narrative. Oh, I'm in gospel. Now I'm in poetry. Now I'm in apocalyptic prophetic. And now I'm like back in poetry, back to prophetic, back to narrative. Like, and you're just like, feel like you're on a ride at the fair getting just jerked all over the place. So that's what makes it a little difficult.
Yeah. And then you're trying to untie what we can always talk about the author in the human sense and the divine sense. This is obviously scripture. It's inspired by God. It's inerrant. It comes from God, but it's in the language and even limited words of John and the tools that he has at his disposal. Right, the language and vocabulary he knows. To express it. So as we do make all those gear shifts into those different types. I think what's in my mind is what's John trying to do, right? He's using this. Why? What does he expect the response from us to be?
Yeah. And so I think we always have to remember what's helpful in reading Revelation is knowing and remembering that John was writing to a specific group of people, right? And so we know that in chapters 2 and 3. We see, this is the letters to the 7 churches in Asia. And, we know that, but we forget a lot of the times that chapters 4 through 22 is also written to them, right? They received this letter.
It's one scroll.
It's one scroll, and when they got to that portion that was for them, that may be 8 to 10 verses, they're like, oh, he called me out, it's almost as if Jesus, wrote to the churches in Rochester, right? And then we got this little section that was saying to Northridge.
Yeah.
Think of it like that. But then it went to Grace Road, then it went to the Father's house, then it went to, next church, but it was this short section that you got highlighted, and then you got kind of called back to faithfulness. But then you got the rest of the letter too.
Right, which is still to you.
It's still to you, right? And so we got to remember that's who he was calling. And he was calling them all to faithfulness. So that's why I'm saying in the series, the undertone of this series is going to be faithful now, because that's what the undertone was in the whole letter to those churches. That if we only read prophetic literature as this is happening in the future, then what is the relevance to today? How does this actually impact how I live today? And that's why prophecy is not this will happen in the future primarily. It is prophecy. We should read prophecy, Old and New Testament, like in Revelation, as thus says the Lord. Thus says the Lord. You read those Old Testament prophets, even those apocalyptic literature ones like Zechariah 9 through 14, Daniel 7 through 12, portions of Isaiah, Ezekiel. You read those, and if you read those sections of their letters as, he's just talking about what will happen. Well, what relevance does that have to those people? It has to have relevance, right? Because 2 Timothy 3:16 says that all scripture is breathed out by God, like you said, but it is profitable for teaching, correction, rebuke, and training in righteousness. So if it's profitable for all those things, it has one of the markers of canonicity for a book to be included in the Bible was it was cross-generational. It was spanned through time and did not have a end date in mind of its application and meaning. And so that Revelation's in our Bible, and so then it does. And so it meant something for them that day. And I think one of my favorite resources diving into this series has been Darrell Johnson's book. It's called Discipleship on the Edge. And it's in our additional resources page for this series. It's kind of a verse-by-verse study through the book. It's like it's a thicker read, but it's kind of almost devotional commentary is kind of what it feels. And he points kind of that out, that this was for a specific people to call them to faithfulness to Jesus. It was calling them in light of their current moment, calling them to faithfulness in Jesus, because he's telling them things that'll happen in the future, but it had application right then. And when we read it, we don't read it with just the lens of like, oh, this is how Jesus is going to win in the end. We read it with like, he's going to win in the end. In light of that, how do I be faithful now? In light of that, how do I be faithful right now? So I think that's why the undertone of the book is be faithful right now. And yes, it is talking about the future, but it has real life application right now. So,
yeah, and the uncertainty about what we see today, shouldn't rob us about certainty of being. People talk about being on the right side of history.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's very easy to be caught up in current issues of your culture today and be swayed this way or that.
Yeah.
And then, in just any controversial issue, we want to be on the right side of history, and Revelation tells us.
Yeah. And so, and what's really cool about that Darrell Johnson points out in the book that I'll just highlight is he says, look at the language that John uses to unfold these events. And he does not say, and this will happen next, and this will happen next. That Revelation unfolds with, and I saw, and I saw, and I saw. And so it unfolds as John saw what happened. Right. And so we can't get into like, let's build this timeline, right? And I know there's so many theological camps that like get in with charts and timelines and like let me break it all down for you and tell you how it's going to go down. But John doesn't seem to be concerned with let me tell you the order at which events will happen. He says
probably didn't know.
He's like,
I mean, he's
and then
like,
I saw, and then I saw.
Yeah, I can't necessarily tell you how things unfold, but I can tell you what I saw. This is what I saw. You want me to explain it to you? This is what I saw.
Yeah, think about a movie storyboard, or when you see a movie, if you saw it on paper, right? If you were just reading and it was trying to tell you about one scene from all these different angles and perspectives, right? You're like, okay, this character is going to see it like this. This character is going to see it like this. But you're talking about the same unit of time. There's other places in our Bible that do this. I remember back to our Moses series, right? Exodus chapters like 19 through 34 are the same unit of time, probably a couple hours spanned, but we have like pages and pages of literature on that. Sure. And, we read the law, when God reveals himself to Moses, gives him the 10 Commandments, and Moses up there on the mountain for 40 days. It's amazing. But at some point in that 40 days, the people are looking up at the temple like, when the heck is this guy going to come down?
Right.
And they're like, we're getting frustrated. Hey, Aaron, build us a God that we can worship, that we can do this out of Egypt with. But they had not received the 10 Commandments yet. They hadn't got it, but we throw them on the bus so quickly. And we read it like, Moses got the law. Well, the people obviously had it. Like, no. He's still up on the mountain, guys. He's still up there. And he hasn't came down yet to deliver them the 10 Commandments. He hasn't came down yet. Now, they do get impatient. They sin against God. They do all that.
Sure.
But it's the same unit of time. And I think we need to think of Revelation kind of in that way. These certain sections that we're going to navigate is we need to realize we have large portions that John's trying to help us excite our imagination with this symbolism that I would go discredit if I didn't say it clearly, is this symbolic nature of this apocalyptic literature is symbolic in nature, but it is tied to a literal, tangible thing. So we can't just symbolize everything. Oh, it's just a symbol. Oh, it's just a symbol. Like meaning that there is literal things that he is seeing that he's describing. He is describing something literal with symbolic language.
Right.
So we can't just symbolize it and say, oh, it's just symbolic.
We have other religions that do that.
We do have other
religions.
And
where they're just, talking about truth, not necessarily tied to history, but Christianity rises and falls on history. That God actually became man, came into history. These things really happened. And here's John talking about future things that will happen. Okay, we might not be able, we might misunderstand exactly how they play out, but yes, we're still talking. We're not just talking about a beautiful painting.
Yeah,
we're talking about God's future work.
Yeah, which is all of that, and the symbolism and all the things you're saying is why we have so many questions, right? And this is why we're going to dive into this series together about these questions that you may have of this, symbolic nature of apocalyptic literature. And so the thing that we want to encourage, anybody who's watching or listening with is we're kind of bringing all the troops together for this series, right? We have our sermons on Sundays. Podcast gets released every Tuesday, but also along with it, we want you diving in and studying this book for yourself.
Read it yourself.
Yeah, and so you can go to the Northridge app on any of the sermon notes at the bottom or somewhere in there. There'll be a link to a additional resources page, or you can just go to iwant.info. There'll be a button for an additional resources page. It's just a single page PDF that we've put together like, okay, read it at this pace because it'll follow the pace that you'll be reading the chapter or two before we teach on it on Sunday. So you'll be ahead of us. You'll be studying it. You'll be leading in, and then we want to help mine the truth with you. We don't want to let me teach you first. We want to help you. You dig into the passage. Now we're going to preach about the themes and help you see some things that are in there, point out where some scholars disagree, and we'll be talking through the series of what is a minor disagreement, where is there overlap, and how can we know the truth, right? And then the podcast on Tuesday that helps answer some questions you may have. So be sure you're submitting those questions all throughout this series. It's 9 weeks long. I think it ends somewhere around Father's Day, so whatever 9 weeks is, right? And so we'll be going through this book, giving ourselves some handles, and hopefully you're connected in a community group where you can talk about the end of the world with all your friends.
Yeah, I absolutely. You're going to get so much more value out of it. The more channels you use, the more value you're going to get out of this. The more it's all going to come together. I know for me, I just I so appreciate the community effort. Me on my own, I'm only going to get so far, but this community effort, and we're working as a team here, I so appreciate that thoughtfulness.
Yeah, all of it's bringing together. So, so give us grace, dive in with us. We're excited to learn some more. I mean, we've written the series, but I'm excited to dive back and to say, like, okay, where do people have questions, or where do they have all those things in? So I would also recommend there's 4 different books on that resource page that I want to point out, and I would not recommend for everyone to pick up every single one of them. I tried to give, as I put it together with our communications team, of a one-line explanation, like, okay, this is what you're going to get with this one, right? This is what you're going to get. There's everything from a theology of the book of Revelation, so it's kind of helping you see the major themes. It's just a big overview. That one's The Joy of Hearing. Then I've already talked about A Discipleship on the Edge by Darrell Johnson, which is kind of a verse. It's kind of a verse-by-verse commentary devotional. It's not a commentary where you're going to get bogged down if you read it, but it's deeper than just your everyday, like, Devo that you pick up for, a 1-page reading. It'll be a couple of pages, not extensive. I think it's like 5 to 7 pages per chapter that you can walk through. But it does feel kind of like a deeper devotional commentary-esque type read. And then All Things New is a biblical theology of Revelation. It talks about why Revelation is the capstone, the last book in the Bible, how that's important, has a lot of richness. That's a part of a series that's actually edited by D.A. Carson. So it's part of a really good series of books. But that one was a really helpful resource. And then there's one other book that's on there, but each one of those has a descriptor of what they are. The last book is Reading Revelation Responsibly. And so it's kind of like, before you even approach this book, realize you have a lot of misconceptions based on in the unit of time you were raised and what you think about the word revelation, apocalypse, and a lot of those things. So hopefully you'll pick one of those resources to kind of read in this 9 weeks as you're reading the book of Revelation, to kind of, like, if you're doing a daily Bible reading plan, I don't know, maybe put it on pause for a couple of weeks and just kind of dive into this book. I don't know. Maybe you want to do that. Maybe you're like, I'm just coming on Sundays and listening to the podcast. That's fine. However you want to approach this, we made it, we hope to make it accessible to have a lot of resources going in the same direction, is our goal. So.
Well, with the book of Revelation, there's 2 extremes of the book of Revelation. Is like, I want every question answered. That's not going to happen. But then the other extreme is just say, can't know anything. There's no point to whatsoever.
Who cares? It's like the one book that Calvin didn't write a commentary on, right?
I actually fact checked myself on
did
that.
You?
Look,
I remember you saying that.
So he wrote commentaries on every book of the New Testament except 2 John, 3 John, and Revelation. And then there's all kinds of speculation as to why. Did he just die before he got to it? Did he
He's like, I'm good.
But it is true. Calvin did not write a commentary on Revelation. We don't have his help on that. But the 2 extremes are, I want every question answered, or I'm not even going to try. Same with these resources, right? It is a bit of a fire hydrant that we've put out there. But it's because there's all kinds of people out here in all kinds of situations. So you need to do you and just grab on something, and use it.
Yeah, and as you dive into those, like, obviously those authors share some of their opinions about those, I don't know if you want to call them problematic passages or views, or how we get 3 different interpretations on this one passage on how the events are going to unfold. And when we get to those passages, we'll talk about those 3 different views. But what we hope to highlight is how those views overlap, that they are talking about the same thing and they get the same truth out of those views. But they disagree on how those events are going to unfold. But it goes right back to the fact that John is telling you things as he saw them, not as they happened. And we could split hairs over, even that language, but at the end of the day, we all agree on one thing. There's one really good, short, thin read that I'll concise in you 1 sentence. There's a book title called Jesus Wins. All right? There's literally a book called Jesus Wins, and it's all the views of Revelation, all the different problematic views, but they all boil down to one thing.
None of those views says Jesus loses.
Yeah, none of those views say Jesus loses. So we're in good company, right? And so, so Jesus wins in the end. We're excited to dive in. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of A Little Better. Be sure to submit your questions, and we're excited to tackle it as you dive in with us over the course of this 9 weeks, learning all about the end of the world.